I am Jared Kubika Miller. I am a professor of communications and a speech and debate coach. We also have Matthew Shapiro, JD, and Tim Seavey from Visolutions. We are all here for DebateSensei. Okay. And today's episode is about language critiques. That was a topic that was suggested by Tim Seavey. And so I think I'll throw the first question your way. Like, what prompted this interest? What's your experience with language critiques?
It actually came up in a very recent round. So I was at a tournament, and this round was one of those ones that I think most judges are afraid to ever get some round that gets this messy. So it was a fairly weird topic, but it required basically one side to be the Russian Federation, and it required the other side to be Syria. So it was like the Russian Federation will withdraw all support from Syria. And that's kind of like a ridiculous policy, right? Like in debate land, we already do things that are impossible and will never happen. But this one, the government team thought was really a far stretch. So they instead had a critical affirmative. So they had a framework that they critiqued the round, and they started with saying that we are all debaters and there's nothing that we do in this round, but our language matters, and so we instead are going to do this micro thing. So it was already starting off on a more philosophical framework, which was fine. Mm-hmm. And the other side came back with 3 topicalities was their response to it. So it was like, all right, this is going to be a kind of dense round, but because there was kind of some acrid language back and forth, I wouldn't say that it was really like over the top.
Okay.
The entire round escalated pretty badly to where one team felt so personally attacked that they ran a language topicality. I don't think it actually should be a topicality, but they had a procedural saying the other team is using foul language. They were using ad hominem attacks. This should, be banned from debate. They should lose for that purpose. So we're already like, we've got kind of a deep in their setup. And the other team, the one that was a little bit more aggressive in their language and used some foul language and was pretty, over the top with it in some ways, said, "How dare you police our language?"
Okay.
And went back with a language critique of like.
Well, that's what you mean by language critique, that it's criticizing the policing of language?
Yeah, so I think, that's kind of honestly a bit of a messy example, but I've seen them in circumstances where people are using a critique, or they're critiquing the language of another team, right? So they're saying, so I suppose you could have said that one team, it was actually, run on both sides. One team was saying that this has become ad hominem, attacks. This is, the language that's being used is not, professional or persuasive. It is, uniquely bad. Or
I've had different sort of experiences. Like Matt, like when we say language critique, what do you think of? Because it wasn't quite that. I don't know what you thought.
I really wanted to discuss critiques just in general. More, I will have no problem. They perfectly apply. I mean, still to what Tim's talking about. Mm-hmm. In regards to when I think of critiques, oftentimes like he's talking about an affirmative critique. We're talking a lot about an argument that you kind of prepare for both sides, no matter what resolution you were working with. And in my experience, I've seen teams who basically can run the same arguments on either side of a debate very often with a critique, essentially challenging the, like Tim's saying, the language of the resolution itself, and that, the language itself will lend itself to some horrible,
It seemed like the thing that Tim was talking about was like they were, it was like a language critique. Like they were
yeah, sort of.
Yeah, you know what I mean? They were criticizing
the response.
Like how dare, like I don't know what I think about that. I mean,
so I guess that's more.
It's a debate. Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe more like a down the rabbit hole example, but I mean, I've run, for example, language critiques on another side using a particular derogatory term, and so I feel like that's maybe the more common practice where people have seen or think of language critiques. Is that what you were thinking?
No, like okay. So one of the things I remember, I think of language critiques as a like category of critiques that on specific sort of discussions about certain words that are used. I'll give a case in point. Case in point would be the terror talk critique, which I thought was brilliant when I was a competitor. You know what I mean? It's like one of those moments where it kind of blows your mind. And you're like, oh, that's a really good one. Where the use of terrorism to justify certain policy, like in the debate circuit, it is lazy. Well, I mean, this is my kind of take on it, but I think it's lazy because I don't know, it becomes just the catchword. And the reason I like it so much is it kind of came true. You know, it's like anytime the United States does something that other countries don't like, they call it an act of terrorism, and vice versa. Whenever anyone else, you know what I mean? So I thought that was like real world. And so I think what Matt was talking about, where you could run it all the time, it was a little modified version of that. You would run it anytime someone brought up terrorism, just as a topic, you know what I mean? And then
using the word itself.
Yeah, just using the word. And so that's what I thought you meant by language critiques and policing language, you know what I mean? And like those ones, I'm totally down for, you know? I mean, I think that's a really interesting
I've had a lot of experiences, you know, where I've hit teams several times, the same partners, the same person even, and you know exactly what they're going to say. And you know, again, it's kind of like I've seen these arguments, especially framed as critiques, where they are able to kind of, no matter what the position they have, affirmative or negative, or almost no matter what the resolution is, if the United States government, for instance, is doing something, they're able to tie in to a critique somehow. And it's really smart, first of all. Like, let's just talk about how if you can really, you know, lock down arguments that, you know, prove some, you know, existential reaction to the plan being done, or some, you know, indirect effect it will have on society itself. If you can plug into that, you know, it's very complicated. Like when you're especially a new debater, you have no idea what to do. And it's similar, you know, to a procedural argument where like it's theory based. We're not talking about necessarily the substance of the resolution itself as you thought when you walked in the room. Often these resolutions are based on current events that you read in the news. And so you get all these facts developed based on the current events. And then some team comes in and they're like, oh, you're perpetuating some problem in society.
Sure, yeah. Like,
you get caught off guard. And it's an argument, again, you could kind of run on either side. And I guess my point is, like, where I wanted to kind of start this conversation is kind of just, there are good ways to run arguments that way, and there's also kind of ways where it feels a little ungenuine, and especially when a judge, for instance, has seen you run it 5 different times on both sides of 3 different resolutions. It feels kind of like we talked about education last week, and how like education arguments are very much like, you know, they can be very important, and if you're kind of hinging the debate on how we can learn from this resolution that, you know, this critique is more important than the resolution itself. If you can make that impactful 10 times in a row, you know, with the same judge, that's amazing. And you're probably
I remember, I mean, everyone kind of gets exposed to this at one point or another, which is kind of weird and ironic because it's backwards, right? Where it's easier to pretend that you're some sort of governing body passing legislation than it is to just be yourself in a round, right? And so, like, for some reason, that sort of policy debate, it just, that's how people get introduced into debate, that particular game. And then the critique is kind of like bringing it to, no, these are our real sort of consequences for word choice and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, it's a weird sort of a development cycle in every debater's career. I mean, I've coached a whole bunch of students, and it seems like there's that similar progression. I don't know how it came about, but it's definitely set, you know.
Something you just said, like, about policy debate, right? One thing about critiques, just inherent, this is from me, who this is going to be a concession that I'm not the greatest debater in the history of time. And I remember, you know, I didn't understand what a critique was for the longest time, and I fumbled with that as a early in my early rounds. And what really made clear to me I used to run critiques as DAs. Okay, like you can kind of say that a disadvantage to this plan or the disadvantage to what they're saying is you
Yeah.
essentially tie in whatever
Yeah.
your critique is. You're saying it's X. Like you can still say it's bad because it's a disadvantage. That's how I always kind of understood critiques. Unfortunately, it actually served me well in the public forum arena. Again, like where you're not really trying to get too in the theory arguments. You're really trying to say like this is a bad idea because X. So
Yeah, I think it's like really true debate, and we get sort of bogged down in the policy debate sometimes. That these are, I mean, these are the arguments that people tend to make. Like critiques happen all the time. You know what I mean? Like in real policy debates. I mean, in Congress and things like that. You know, like anytime they're not talking about the specifics of the plan, but how it sort of, I don't know, it implies, that we're being, moving towards socialism or something. That's a critique right there. That's not a policy. That's not a disadvantage. You're like, it just kind of seems like this is a socialist idea, and socialism is fundamentally wrong. So reject the idea, whether it's like education, healthcare, or things like that. It's like, those are critiques. And I think the more people sort of know about it, they can say, oh, these are how to respond to those arguments as well.
Sure. Well, I think so that may be a cleaner tie into the greater conversation of policing language, in that I've seen critiques used punitively, right? So the other side, and I've even used them myself. So for example, there was a round that was on gun control, and so we were on the negative side. The government team was saying, we're going to pass policies to make, to set background checks and mental health checks. So it's like, okay, this is pretty straightforward, straight logical. But then the way that they went about talking about folks with different mental abilities, right, like disabled folks or people with mental health issues, was really, really nasty. Like they kept using the word maniac, which, like, okay, if you're talking about an active shooter, sure, few people are going to defend that person. But if you're talking about like all folks that have mental disabilities that should not be purchasing weapons, I don't know if it's really fair to use the term like maniacs and psychos, and like, so we called shame once or twice to say like, that's really not an okay way to use that language in this round. And we ended up, I think it was in the member speech, like creating a critique out of it. So our theory was coming from Judith Butler and discussing like ableism and the way that we, craft ableist arguments, and the way that we give access really creates this like otherization of people that have different mental abilities, or that may be dealing with, some mental handicap, whatnot. So we ended up winning on that point because the other side didn't change their language. And it could have been just as simple as like, oh, sorry, shouldn't have used the word maniac, shouldn't have used the word psycho, right? It's all kinds of words that we've sort of chosen that these are acceptable in maybe debate land and these are not acceptable in debate land. And I think sometimes for really good reason. However, I have seen those same types of arguments of, don't use those words, don't use that kind of language. I've seen that used really punitively in kind of a gotcha type way, where it's like creating a new list of like, these are words that are now unacceptable and you should be punished for them, you should lose for them. And it's sort of like our conversation last week. It takes you aback. Like, wait a second, I broke the rules, not of debate, but also just of language. Like I broke the rules of society. Like I broke the debate. What happens?
I think I'd like to see it. I'd like to see it just framed not necessarily as like, oh, punish these people, but more like a way of like curating the language of debate. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, listen, right. I don't think we want to endorse that.
There's two ways these things can kind of come up. There's the ones that are prepared. I mean, and often they're prepared, like Jared was talking earlier, for a word. Like if they say the word terrorist, we're going to use this critique. Mm-hmm. But there's other prepared ones, like Tim mentioned, affirmative critiques, where the affirmative team comes out and literally gives a critique basically on the resolution. The one I think that sticks a little harder, and I have actually a personal experience with, is in my final round at the NIDA tournament for public forum. The gold round, the opposing team called my partner sweetheart on cross-examination. And it was an opportunity, right? There's a moment where, I mean, it's not, I don't mean to be cynical in saying it's an opportunity. It was, I do believe truly that it's not, proper. You shouldn't necessarily say that to someone, if you respect them as a human being and as a debater. But it rose itself, and I saw it, and I told my partner, I think that alone, as if we can just cover all of our ground and not really mess anything up at that point. She ended up bringing it up again in her rebuttal, and it really inked the debate. We won that round, and I do believe, I call it the sweetheart debate, because literally, like, I believe that, like, it was a public forum debate, first of all, which is important because we're talking about critiques. But what's important to also know is an opportunity came about where someone said something where it took the air out of the room. You saw it in the judges, you saw it in the people watching, you saw it, I felt it. I made the face, you know what I mean? Like, dang, like, and at first I was like, oh, I'm just going to rip it apart. And I actually got feedback from a judge who said, you should have said something more. But I was very much like, I need to cover all the ground. I don't want to miss anything on this flow. They said a lot. We said a lot. I did say, like, really quick, it was inappropriate, but I didn't really get into it. And then on her rebuttal, she kind of shut it down. Yeah. I didn't spend 6 minutes talking about it, which I was worried. I didn't want to do that either. But that, I think, is kind of very relevant to this conversation. And, like, it seems a little more genuine when the opportunity arises, even compared to, like, the terrorist word, where, like, it might come up, like,
sure.
So.
Well, I think, like, I guess I might be in the minority on this, but I don't see critiques as just being some sort of, like, response to offense. It's like, oh, I feel offended. Here's my critique. That's not. I don't know. I think that they're way more than that. I mean, we're having a discussion about how we talk to each other, and it's probably one of the more important discussions to have, because while discussions about what would we do if we were in charge are fun, things that are actually kind of meaningful are, how do we talk to each other? Those are the things that we have to deal with every single day. And I like those. But if, like, there's so much better reasons why they're important, and how you're supposed to frame a critique in a debate round, and what does it mean for our community and stuff. That's why I was talking about, like, maybe it's more of think of it more as playing a role of curating the language that we use in debate.
Sure.
So much. One thing I love about debate in general, I don't care what you're in, like, it's all about having a conversation as civilly as you can, even though it can get very heated. And the critique is just one of those things where, like, we are not policing language in a sense where we're not trying to be dictatorial, but we do voice our opinion on what you think is right. Sure. And, like,
but I mean, debate is a language game. It's all language. That's all it is. Like, if we can't like criticize each other's language, like, what the hell are we doing?
Or hold each other to each other's language.
Yeah.
Talk about the implications of the words that we're using, and why you chose those words. So much is systematically built into people, and myself.
If there's any group who's going to be, like, really choosing their words wisely, it should be debaters.
Sure. Well, I think so. Taking that to a little broader level for a second, because I similarly enjoy when you get really cool theory debates. So, like, I've had a lot of rounds that are about nuclearism was one of the topics. Like, as soon as one side starts talking about nuclear war, that is usually, like, the game over, right? And so we had a whole critique. Like, our team had this critique that we worked on about the only people that are likely to use nuclear weapons are the ones that are constantly talking and obsessing about them. And so it is that, like, manifestation of everything is about nukes that actually creates the danger. But so, like, I agree. Like, I think there's definitely fun theory arguments to be had in that. Taking a step back from debate, though, I think that when language, so I think language policing, even in itself, to have a critique on that, like, that has such a negative connotation, right? Like, you can't police my language and tell me what I can and cannot say. But that said, that's similarly used usually from someone that has either made a faux pas, like they maybe didn't intend to say something that was, rhetorically harmful, but it came across that way. And I think that there's an important mechanism of how that is brought up, right? So I think just kind of like topicalities, there are times and places when it's more appropriate or less, but really it's also in how they're presented. So when you're brand new into debate, or at least you're fairly new into it, and the first time you're coming against something like a language critique, or they're talking about the ways that we're using language, or some of the rhetoric that's made in the round, it can seem like a shutdown, right? Like this cancel culture of like, how dare you, right? Like say anything. And I think that idea can be a little bit of a turnoff to debate as a community. That said, I think that they're also really, really important for teaching. Like it's a learning mechanism. Like sometimes you learn by losing the round because you didn't do it right, or you have learned that you can use your words more carefully and be more thoughtful about the language that we use. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it? I think in general,
there's a lot of turnoffs in debate. There's a lot of things that turn people off to debate. You know what I mean? Like speed, in certain aspects. And so, really dense philosophical arguments are what you should expect in debate, in my opinion. It's like people are so shocked by it all the time. Kind of like, these are what people are arguing about within our field of communication. All we do is talk about rhetoric all the time. And so
Jared,
like, that significance is looking backwards, it kind of strikes me. I'm like, I went through that same process and it seems so apparent to me now.
There's an aspect too where like the first time, so many times, like, especially in LD or policy where you have like one all year long and you get real used to, some team running some argument. It is also, it works in other forms, LD or, any form. But my point is, when you start seeing someone throughout a season or a year or the years run the same arguments, the burden is partially on you to go get responses to those arguments, because although you may get shocked the first time, what's your excuse the 10th time? And like, what's really interesting, like Tim was saying, is you end up having these very deep conversations because you end up having teams who kind of know what the other side is going to say, and they have second, third levels of argument to argue why they're right. And you can have these deep, substantive debates that are we are dedicating minutes on to a critique on either side and responding to, and it's like substantive. You're learning, unlike the concept of abuse, like we talked about last week, where like when someone just says the word critique and they say you're being this or that, and then they don't really explain that, they aren't substance. They have no substance. They're not a voter if you don't make it one and really articulate to a judge. Again, if they've never heard it before, be slow. If they've heard it 20 times, maybe you could rapid fire through your argument again. But explaining why and really getting the substance out of these, language arguments.
So I think to your point, that's exactly what I was trying to suss out earlier, was a question coming from as a voting issue. I think sometimes, similar to procedural arguments, I guess you could count a critique as one, people will use critiques as a mechanism for an instant win, right? So they'll throw the a priori label onto a critique, saying that, outside this round, nothing has changed. It's only hearts and minds and the language that we use. That's the only thing that really matters. Therefore, this should be evaluated absolutely first before any other stock issues. And therefore, the other team, because they violated, they should lose. I have seen arguments, or I've seen opportunities that teams give where they say, they give the other team an out, right? So they say, like, if you just change your language, this entire thing goes away and we can move on with the debate. And I find that to be so much more appealing if they legitimately stand behind. So like terror talk or something, right? Like if they stand behind what they are saying and are not just using it as a tactic, I think that giving the other team an out of like, hey, this is an educational moment. If you want to go ahead and change your language, then we can move on to the debate and this is no longer an issue, is one way to go about it. Do you think that it's meritorious enough to be a voting issue of like a team violates something, they learn that they violated something, and now they're voted down on it? Or do you think that there ought to be a reversibility?
No, it seems even more punitive if you're like, all right, if you just say you're sorry, then everything goes away. I'm like, let's have a discussion. You know what I mean? Like, I think that as a community, once the debate's over, we shouldn't be holding people to what they said in the round as some sort of personal opinion of theirs. Right? That they've been assigned aside, and what they decided to do with that, whether or not they were going to critique it, or they were going to just debate it straight up, or they were going to, do any other variety of strategy. That if we're going to keep this a learning activity, then we can't. We actually have to separate what a person believes from what they say in debate rounds.
Sure.
Like we have to keep, I think it's important to respect that, because sometimes people, they learn a lot. And if we're like, well, when you were a freshman, you said the exact opposite. So you're like, I'm sorry, you're on the record. You have to stick with it from here on out.
Oh, no, for sure. And I don't think that's what I mean with it. I think, I guess I'm surprised to hear you think that it's more punitive to be like, apologize and change. I think that gives an opportunity, yes, a conversation, a discussion should be had. So I guess maybe that's your point of we should debate whether or not the language, the word terrorism is an acceptable justification for, prompting a policy, or maybe discuss whether or not nuclearism is a thing, right?
Well, yeah, when you tell somebody to apologize, you're assuming they are saying these things because that's what they believe, rather than.
I see. Okay.
You know what I mean?
Gotcha.
Imputing the inference into them,
if you just treat it kind of like, nope, when we're talking about this issue, that language actually derails us from any sort of goal. So, and that's why you should be voted down, because that's a poor way to talk about this issue. Not because you're a bad person for saying the wrong words.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's different.
I guess, would so just giving an alternative, right? So the other team comes up and yep, totally right. We justified it previously by saying, we're combating terrorism. These are counterterrorism efforts, and we'll go ahead and relabel those that we're going to be nation building or some other
masking,
some other awful term. But hey, they're going to come up with different language. Do you think that makes any impact or any change on the round, or is it you started with the argument, or you started with those words to represent your argument, therefore you're kind of stuck with it? What do you think?
I have a quick little thing about a response to one of these arguments. I mean, and one way to kind of test for abuse also, just a little bit, if you really do feel trapped, you're totally new, or you just you're stuck and lost and hit with a gut punch, ask if there is, how is this non-unique to any plan, or how is this non-unique to any, action by whatever entity or whatever connection they are tying to their critique. Mm-hmm. Isolate that and ask, how is that not unique to any other thing that they do? And if what you can kind of do is, if you can kind of put them in a position where oh, you have literally no ground in this debate. I think that's a good way, if you can get there. Often you can't, but if you can get there and kind of get them to admit oh, there's literally no way you can win this debate. Well, then in my mind, that can kind of take a lot of wind out of a sail of a judge, if they're oh, then there's no reason to be in here. I can't wait. I shouldn't vote on this if there's no reason to be here. So if you can get there, maybe an more inexperienced person who's running with a K or doesn't fully flesh out their argument, you might be able to get there. It's a dangerous road. You might walk right into a minefield, but just know that if you're trapped, there's maybe a response to kind of what Jared was saying.
I think, okay, so debate is this language game, and by its very nature, language can't back you into a corner that you have no response to. It is so ambiguous and abstract.
You're the master,
Yeah, you know what I mean? Kind of there's always something to say. Maybe you don't like the ground that you're given, but you do the best you can with it and just try it out that one time. And so defend yourself. You know what I mean? Language isn't like Harry Potter, where you say a magic word and there's an effect that happens reliably every single time with flick the wand quite right. It's
it can feel that way.
Yeah. All right. Hey, I think we had a pretty good discussion about this, and clearly it's really complicated, but that's our time right now, everybody. Okay, so I want to thank Matthew Shapiro, JD, Tim Seavey from Visolutions. All of us are from DebateSensei. I'm Jared Kubika Miller, and we'll see you next week. Keep an eye out for our announcements. All right, later.
Thanks.